live in a culture that teaches us that we should just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. It doesn't matter what's happening. It doesn't matter what's going on. We should just be motivated. We should just get over it, and we should just live our lives and pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We've been taught that there's no crying in baseball, meaning that when you're in your job, when we're at work, when we're doing something professional, that really we should not let anything in our personal lives come into play. We should not show any emotion, no matter what is unfolding in the depths of our lives. We must separate the two. We've been taught that if you cry or show vulnerability, that you are weak, that you are a sissy. We've lived this faith that has said, when death and loss comes, we say the platitude of God must have needed another angel. And what all of those things do is leave us without a space to grieve, without a space to claim our loss, without a space to say, I am not okay and life is hard. And the most interesting thing is that as people of faith, we actually have a whole book dedicated to feeling, dedicated to lamenting and mourning and sorrow, and that's the book of Lamentations. A book that addresses grief, a book that leans into loss. But it's not just about lamentations. Out of the hundreds of Psalms, there are 44 Psalms that are about lamenting. Out of those 44, 30 of them are about individual, something that has happened in someone's life. The rest of them are about what's happening to the community and what they've lost, what they are grieving, how they are sorrow, and how they are mournful. And yet, we lean into a culture that says, pull yourselves up by yourselves and get over it. Don't cry, don't show emotion, and by all means, don't be vulnerable in front of anybody else. And yet there's this story, it's not the only one, but there's this story of a leader. The leader's name is David, and if you were traveling with us a few weeks ago and you were with us, David was just a boy. And David was one that wasn't afraid to slay the really huge, insurmountable things that lie in front of him. Well, now David is older, he's wiser. He's taken the throne as the king. And this is what happens. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And the word comes to him that the troops have fled from battle and that many of the soldiers have fallen and died. And then the guy coming to David says this, what's more is Saul and his son Jonathan have also died. Saul is David's mentor. Saul is the one that said, hey, David, you need to be the one that comes after me. And Jonathan is one of David's best friends. And the guy that's the reporter, the person coming to David, he says, I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I've brought them here to you. Listen to this next part. Then David grabbed his clothes and he ripped them, and all of the soldiers did the same. They mourned And they cried and they fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, the Lord's army, the whole house of Israel, because they had died by the sword. Here's a person, a leader, who word comes to him that loss and grief have happened, that death has occurred, and David doesn't care what anybody else thinks. David does something holy. David creates a space to mourn and to grieve, and he doesn't care what anybody else thinks. The pain is so sharp, it is so profound that David's response is physical. The lament that he has to rip the outer garment that he's wearing. He's so empty. And I imagine that it wasn't just tears, but that it was a wailing that might have sounded as if an animal was hurt, because this is his friend and mentor. And David's grief, David's unashamedly willingness to share his grief creates a space for everybody else to mourn. It's personal. It's an individual kind of mourning, because each person had a different relationship with Saul, a different kind of relationship with Jonathan. David does this thing. Not only does he mourn, not only is it so physical and so painful that he cries out. A little bit of time lapses, and David wants to make sure that the community has a place and a space of acknowledgement of their loss. And so David writes a song. David is actually the writer of many of the Psalms of lament. But David writes a song of grief that he painstakingly teaches his community. They sing over and over in hopes that the people and the words will connect. And it wasn't just about Saul. David wrote the song so that in times of sorrow, in times of grief and death and loss, that they would have words to come back to, that they would have a melody that they could sing, that they would have a common interest point that they could return to. David created a space for loss and grief and trauma. We, as people, have missed that space in the last year, really a year and a half. I can only speak to the things that I've lost. I didn't experience death of a person. I was a parent who watched her 18-year-old's birthday come and go in the middle of COVID, who watched and longed for her teenager to be able to dress in her suit to go to prom to take her girlfriend, who waited and longed for a graduation date that barely came, who didn't get to celebrate moving off to college in the wonderful form fashion that so many of us had. I mourned the loss of a congregation of people that I had known for 2 years that I did not get to say goodbye to. I experienced grief and loss walking into a congregation that I was not able to get to know. I experienced grief of not knowing who to invite into space to help me prepare the altar, to lead worship, to sing songs. I mourn the loss of standing and moving a community into a new place. I mourn the loss of many things in the last year. I'm not alone in that. Some of you have mourned the loss of your kids stepping into a building for school. You mourned the loss of a job that you loved, but you couldn't go into the office for, and you couldn't be collaborative with your teammates, and so it became confusing and overwhelming. And the traveling that you did made it even harder. Some of you had personal loss, friends that died not necessarily of COVID, but that died in the midst of it, and we didn't celebrate as well. Some of you had family members that did die of COVID. We've had individual losses, and the things that's happened, the interesting thing is that we didn't create a space to claim those losses, to lament. Because as we talked to one another or we saw each other on social media, what really happened was we thought everybody else's life was held together and that they were doing okay. And it became a competition of who hadn't seen whose parents longer instead of lamenting together. We pulled inward and we didn't create a space to lament, to mourn. We've watched children who died of terminal illnesses that we were not able to go and see, and we were not able to be with our students. And what David did was he mourned, and he wasn't comparing his grief to anybody else's. He let it show. He was vulnerable. He was real. He claimed it, and he created a space. And then he took a breath, and he created a space for the community to lament together. Because let's be real. We had a pastor of 5 years that we didn't get to hug it out with. We had watched his 2 children grow into beautiful children that were young when they got here, in elementary and middle school when they left. And we didn't get to say how much we love them. We lament that we don't get to share a common cup together at communion. We are lamenting and grieving that we never, ever got to say goodbye to ministries that had been prominent, that had made a difference for us, but now are no longer, and that will probably never come back in the form that they were. And we are still a bit angry and sorrowful and mourning for that. I gotta tell you, one of the beautiful things about grief and sorrow is that in one of the 5 steps it says that we have to walk through anger. And I didn't have time to walk through anger in the last year. My anger actually came in this spring as I watched all these graduates get prom and graduation. They're talking about their schools. They're having their summer interns that were not canceled. They're getting to be camp counselors that our kid was not. My anger came as my colleagues who are moving today don't have to move in the middle of COVID. What have you been angry about that you haven't claimed because we've been too busy taking care and surviving and trying to keep our heads above water? In this community, in this space, God is reminding us that Saul wasn't the only one that created space for weeping and mourning, and that the only way through sorrow and grief is to create a space to claim it. Jesus is out on the road and he gets word that his best friend has died. And Jesus doesn't hold it in. He stands there and he weeps openly, mourning, creating a space for individual sadness and loss, and yet moves it into a communal experience. Today, God is creating the space for us, telling us that if we need to clench our fist and pound on a Bible or pound on a book and release our frustration and our anger over the last year and a half of the things that we haven't quite claimed that we lost and that we are grieving, then we can do it. If we need to stand in the middle of our homes with no one else around and yell and scream at the top of our lungs, ripping every part of the sore out, then do it. If we need to bow our heads in these pews or stand in the shower alone and let the tears fall, then let us do it. Today, God is reminding us that there are many resurrections, and they come when we are willing to give space to our grief and our loss. That God's faithfulness is seen when we become angry and claim our anger and we move into acceptance. Resurrection isn't something to be taken lightly, and new birth isn't something that we just talk about. It's the thing that happens after grief. It might take us a year. It might take us 2 years. But there is a mini resurrection coming for you and for me and for each and every one of us. Let us claim our sorrow, our grief, and let us lament with all that we have. Let us pray.